Okay, so why don't we get started? Good evening to those of you in the audience who are in Shanghai time or in nearby time zones. I think that's where the majority of the audience are located. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are able to join us from elsewhere. So welcome and welcome back to the webinar series run by the Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai. My name is Selena Hong, Assistant Professor of Literature and the Center's Interim Director during this academic year. Today's event is the last of this semester's webinars, and we feel very excited and honored to have Professor Josh Stemberg as the speaker to give us the grand finale, if I may borrow the word from performing arts. So those of you who detected my borrowing of the language, you know that today's talk will touch on genres in Chinese drama and theater, specifically how they go global, transform and manifest internationally in Europe, the Americas, and Southeast Asia. That will be more or less, I think, the framework of today's topic. And the kind of transnationalization of this particular genre or genres, not just among communities of Chinese descent, but also within, I guess, the broader network of non-Chinese artists, patrons, and audiences. So those of you who are in the fields of Chinese theater, Chinese and Sinophone literature, and Sino-Indonesian culture surely have read some works by Professor Josh Stemberg, but let me still do a little bit of introduction, especially for those of you outside or in other related fields. So Professor Stemberg is a senior lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Sydney. He worked as a foreign liaison for the Jiangsu Kunqu Company, Jiangsu Kunqu Yuan, from 2001 to 2004, and studied and taught in Nanjing again from 2011 to 2015. He was a Fulbright Taiwan Fellow and a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow in theater and film before taking up this current position at the University of Sydney. Josh has published extensively on various forms of Chinese origin Xiqu and their transformation or localization abroad as what he calls a global genre, as well as Chinese and Sinophone literatures and their translations. Additionally, I should also mention that within the Southeast Asian context, his work on Sino-Indonesian literature, performance, and community culture, which stretches from the period of late colonial Dutch East Indies through the present Reformasi period in post-colonial Indonesia, has made what I think is one of the most important recent contributions to scholarly conversations, not just on the long-term development and hybridization of Chinese migrant networks, but I think also on the formation of modern Indonesian national culture. And here I'm specifically referring to his book published in 2019 called Minority Stages, Sino-Indonesian Performance and Public Display, from which I personally benefited greatly and which I think is a milestone on many accounts. And I'm pretty sure that many scholars in this field will no doubt agree with me on this comment. So among many other things, and I would definitely encourage our audience members to read this book on your own, I'll just say that this book really admirably connects different archives, field sites, and methods that are usually kept apart or are difficult to bridge because of linguistic, disciplinary, and other practical barriers common in the scholarship on Southeast Asian studies. And I was just chatting with Professor Stemberg, and I told him about this challenge that I myself also faced when conducting my own scholarship. But not only that, I think on a personal level, and I should also say that I admire Josh's work, particularly because of two things, among many others. First, the strong will that I see in his tireless excavation and discovery of understudied materials and firsthand participation in the community culture that he studies. And second, the level of respect that I see in his book that he shows to the Sino-Indonesian communities that he converses with, especially regarding the intricate question of identity, which he also reflects very movingly toward the end of that book. So I think Josh's talk today will touch on some of this Indonesian context, but also extends to include Euro-American societies as well. So a quick reminder to our audience before I hand the floor over to Josh. So during the first hour, we will listen to Josh in his webinar, and afterward, we will conduct the Q&A with the audience. So here are two ways for you to ask questions. At the bottom of your Zoom control panel, you should see two functions, the raise hand function and the Q&A box. So you could either click on the raise hand icon, and when I see that you clicked raise hand, I will see a little icon on the side of your name, then I will call upon you and invite you to unmute your microphone. We will do that from the background on your behalf so that you can speak directly with Josh and interact with him. So I highly encourage everyone to use this function. Alternatively, you can also type down your question in this Q&A box, and you can do that either during the talk or after the talk, during the Q&A, whenever you think of a question. So what I will do as today's moderator is when I see those questions, I will then either read or summarize the questions on your behalf, or I will invite you to unmute and then read the question on your own if you so prefer. Okay, so now without further ado, let us welcome Professor Josh Stemberg.
Thank you so much, Professor Hong, for that generous introduction, probably too generous. I don't know that I can live up to it, but I will try to make some interesting comments on a different area of my work related to the Sino-Indonesian cultures that I wrote my monograph about and that Professor Hong kindly mentioned. And as the title suggests, I am trying here to expand my scope a little bit, perhaps a little bit extravagantly, beyond the area where I have mostly worked, which is Southeast Asia, but to other transnational contacts with the theater and intellectual communities, literary communities of Europe, of the Americas, though really I'll be focusing on a particular tour of Canada in 1960, but related to Latin American tours of the same period. And then going back to Indonesia again, to Southeast Asia, in order to try and maybe think through how we might consider Xiqu, Chinese drama, Chinese theater in a, how we might bring these strands together. I think often we get stuck in a little bit, maybe I get stuck in a little bit of a national silo, and I think, oh, well, here's the Myanmar history of, Guangdong theater, and here is the Manila history of Minnan theater, and here is the Peruvian history of Cantonese theater. And, at some point, they're all fascinating. They're all fascinating. The people who do them are often great artists, and they're worth studying in their own right. But at some point, I would like to try and connect the dots a little more. And what I'm doing today is to share with you some of the lines of thinking that I'm beginning to develop in those areas, and hope to get feedback from you about what works and what doesn't, and where you think this ought to go. All right. So my feeling is that Xiqu, Chinese opera, it enjoys instant visual recognition in the Western world, not least by virtue of its distinctive costuming and makeup. You see a, Jingju Hualian, and people recognize it right away. It becomes a symbol. It was used in the Beijing Olympics. It was used in the Shanghai Shibuhui Expo. But at the same time, as a performance experience, it remains relatively unfamiliar to the large majority of theatergoers in the Americas, in Europe, in Australasia, and I think probably even in Southeast Asia, though it's more familiar there. So that is to say, a promoter, a presenter, an academic, a translator who is trying to find an audience outside of Chinese majority societies or communities is always faced with the task of promoting or pitching not only a particular performance, but the whole genre, or indeed the entire, Xiqu, Chinese opera complex of genres. Any project of that kind is rendered complex by the fact that promoters or explicators must seek to represent a far from unitary system featuring a sort of uneven prestige among genres. That is to say, people look on puppet theater differently than they look on Quinchu, as well as influences drawn from abroad, since there's an intensive interaction with the Western and the Japanese stages. So there's certain genres, you might think that certain genres, more represent an older, more classical China, and some of them are more westernized or modernized, right? You might think that Shaoxing Yueju is a more modern, or later developed form of theater than Quinchu, and you would have reason to think that, or then Li Yuanxi, or then Guangdong Yueju, maybe. The reason I sort of mention a promoter, presenters, academic or translator is because I've sort of been all these things, right? I'm an academic. I try to come at these from an objective point of view as much as possible. But then there have also been times where, or I've brought Quincy performances to Vancouver and had to try and convince people, why they should see this performance. I've accompanied as a translator the Yuanxi, so that's Quanzhou, Minnan Yuanxi theater, to performances in France and Greece, and had to explicate them for the French press or for French academics, Swiss academics, Greek academics, audiences. So I think it's easy to overestimate when we say, 中国文化走出去, Chinese culture going global. It seems like a sort of accomplished fact, and that apparently there's the one thing that's going abroad, and then maybe we don't hear enough about what happens, once it's there, or I don't, haven't patterned enough. What are the different natures of those transactions, the different modes? One of the words I'm going with here is sort of modes of translation. Modes of performance. So what I've got here is a, maybe brutally simple for the moment, kind of little typology of the kinds of theaters. And my idea is that depending on the type of theater that is going abroad or that has gone abroad, you might ultimately also have knock-on effects about how Chinese culture is viewed. And so, I'll be giving examples from 3 of these types, and I'll explain why I'm not doing the 4th one a little bit. But I think that if I think of, the profile of Xiqu in a city like Vancouver or Sydney or San Francisco, and its profile in a city like Paris or Berlin or Moscow, or its profile in a city like Manila or Jakarta or Yangon, I think it has something to do with these different, that there isn't the one Xiqu going abroad. There isn't the one mode of performance. That perhaps is very obvious, but I don't think we've really got the toolbox yet. So one of them is the migrant form, the Cantonese theater, often in the Anglophone settler, colonial states, so the Americas, Australasia. Then there are the high diplomatic modes, that is to say, the PRC, or historically also, well, even now also the ROC, sending, making a kind of cultural exchange, using using theater to make a diplomatic advance, or a cultural diplomatic statement. So we'll be looking at the 1960 tour of the 中国艺术团, the China arts troupe, to Canada. And then there is the academic sinological, and that, I'm sort of dealing simultaneously with performance and texts. Sinological is there, it has a role in the performance circulations, because universities are a lot more likely to be hosting, for instance, Quinchu, than they are to be hosting, say, a Suju, which is also from Suzhou, or whatever, Huaiju or something. The universities are drawn to certain kinds of performance and theater. So there is a role in the performance space, but a lot of the sort of first encounter with Chinese theater is through text, let's say through Chinese drama. And that gives us then a sort of sinological pathway, which in the example we'll look at then leads us again back to the stage. We'll be looking at Pipaji. And there is also a commercial type of Chinese opera abroad, Xiqu abroad. It doesn't seem to me like this is presently a major type, because I think most of the theaters that go abroad, they have either financial support from a migrant community or from official channels, or from academic side. I don't think that there's a lot of sort of profit-making touring that goes on right now, but it certainly historically was an important mode. So if we look at the Minnan trips of the, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, if we looked at the Gezaixi going abroad, the Gaojiaxi, including the puppets, there were periods where, especially to Southeast Asia, where commercial motives were central. But I won't be looking at any at the commercial mode of performance today. And again, the reason I think we might want to do this typology is because it seems to me that depending on what kind of theater goes abroad, you get a different shaping, a different contribution to the shaping of what Chinese culture is in foreign eyes. I'm really glad that I can use sort of Southeast Asian examples, because I think it's important. Southeast Asia is possibly the main, one of the main areas of contact with China and foreign, cultural exchange, performance exchange, literary exchange. But I think the sort of geopolitical setup of our present world and of the academic institutions pushes us a lot closer, generally speaking, to, say, Chinese American exchanges than to, Sino-Burmese, Sino-Myanmar, or let's say Sino-Khmer exchanges, although those histories are at least as important, I would think. Anyways, so that's part of my motivation for trying to deal with it in a global sphere, so that we don't get stuck in a Sino-Western kind of rut. All right, so I'm starting with Pipaji. Here is a historic version, publication of Pipaji. I just want to nod briefly to the fact that the Pipaji is a narrative that is done, in many different genres. That is done in Kunqu here on the right and in Liyuanqi. So it's already diverse. It's the kind of text, as is often the case with the late imperial theater, the Yuanmingqing theater. We don't have a single version. We have multiple versions, and then ultimately, when we look at which versions go abroad, which versions get translated sinologically. So this is the first example. I'm looking at the sinological travels of Pipaji. Then it becomes really relevant, which manuscripts, which versions, which recensions reached libraries in France in which year, right? So in which year do we know that manuscripts were, purchased in Jiangxi, so that they could, and then that they appeared in the Bibliothèque du Roi, so that sorry, here more of these. This is Pipaji in cinema in Guangdongxi. But it ends up being relevant to figuring out why translations look a certain way, because in our case here, the last one here, Bazin, Antoine Bazin publishes his translation of Pipaji, L'Histoire du luth, Le Pipaki, in 1841, and so he's referring to three different three different recensions that are available in France at that time. He calls it a translation, but as is often the case with these kinds of movements, we find that rather than the 42 scenes we might expect, we are left with 24. So he has condensed it. He has made it more accessible for the French reading public. As far as we know, it was never performed. I think a really good PhD project would be to really figure out, really work through the Bazin translation, and figure out what really are the principles according to which he makes his adaptation. He is later criticized by both French sinological sources and later translators for not translating the whole thing. But its reception at the time is very positive, and I think it's partly because of his tweaking. Well, he cuts almost half of it, so maybe more than tweaking, his adjustment of Pipaji and his really highlighting of certain scenes that he think will appeal to the French readership, and that's I think what gives it its status in French sinology, and through that then to French and later English and German accounts of the place of China in world theater, the place of Chinese drama in world theater. As we can see, it's sort of part of a little, little golden age of translation of French drama, of Chinese drama into French by Stanislas Julien and Bazin, Julien being Bazin's teacher. It's thought that probably they translate drama. They have a preference for translating drama because the texts are both easy to get and relatively easy to understand. So it's clear that the earlier translation, the mid-18th century translation there by Prémart, which generates Voltaire's famous play L'Orphelin de Chine, it's clear that Prémart doesn't understand the verse. By the time we get to Pipaji, Bazin translates the verse in a lot of cases, but he doesn't translate it as verse. So one of the big changes that he makes is he sort of makes it into a prose version, which then, being a prose version, makes it resemble more the plays that are popular in the mid-19th century in France. Here we have some. He writes also so Théâtre Chinois and the Pipaji both contain sort of longish prefaces where he explains how he sees the place of the Pipaji in Chinese theater and where Chinese theater then fits in world theater. Also, for Bazin, there's a clear progression from the Zaju, from the shorter plays, some of which he translates in Théâtre Chinois, I think 4 of which he translates in this earlier volume, to Pipaji, which seems to him more refined and more complete and more plausible in its action. So he's got a narrative of progression within Chinese theater. These early translations, these mid-19th century, well, the early translation, the Prémart translation, and these translations by Bazin and Julien in the mid-19th century, I think lead pretty directly to a particular canon of Chinese drama in the Western languages. Because of the early translation of Huilanji, we get the Brecht and Klabund Kreidekreis chalk circle plays. Because of the early translation of Zhao Siguar, we get not only Voltaire's play, but also an Italian play, Cimarosa, and an English one, James Fenton. And in Pipaji, we get this American version that we'll see in a moment, as well as a German version called Die Laute, both of which are staged. Lute song has an important place in the early Broadway view of what Chinese theater looks like. Here is, we're going to have, these are all worth consideration, in a longer time, but for today's purposes, I will just sort of rush through them. So Vincent Hundhausen is a German sinophile teaching at Peking Imperial University and translating enormous amounts. First, he translates from Latin, but then once he's in China, he translates Xixiangji, he translates Mudanting, and he translates Pipaji, but he doesn't read Chinese. And so this is a really interesting moment of translation because the well-known Germanophile poet Feng Zhi sort of narrates it to him line by line. And so Hundhausen makes both claims. He criticizes Bazin for eliding a big chunk of it, um, but doesn't claim that he can read the Chinese himself. Instead, he says it's word for word a translation of Pipaji, except that it's as told to me line by line by Feng Zhi. So he doesn't claim sinological capability, but does claim complete sort of authenticity as a translation for his work. And he stages them. So as you can see here, this is, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of pictures, but there are a few. This is from the Bundesarchiv in Germany, of a scene from Pipaji. So this is the examination scene from Pipaji. Among the earliest, among the earliest foreigners performing Chinese drama that I think we have anywhere. In 1925, Pipaji is actually performed in Boston in English, but by Chinese students, by Liang Shiqiu and Bing Xin and people like, prominent people in the Republican, later to be prominent people in the Republican drama scene. So Pipaji is often used as an introduction. All right. Still mostly on the sinological side here, although also coming into the migrant side is Will Irwin. He is an American journalist who sees Pipaji in San Francisco. He sees a Cantonese opera production of Pipaji maybe more than once. He finds it fascinating. He also can't understand Cantonese, so he pays somebody to sit next to him and explain to him the story. But then because he doesn't know that there's a French translation, and there is no English translation, so he wants to perform it, but cannot have it performed. There's no text. And so he eventually is given, much later in life, he is given a copy of the Bazin translation. He does read French, and then he works up the lute song. So the lute song is first performed without music in 1930, not on Broadway, in the Berkshire Theatre Festival in Massachusetts. But we can see that it's still sort of mostly a sinological avenue, in that people are performing it because making a claim to Chinese authenticity, to being derived from a particular Chinese drama based on a French translation or adaptation, really, of the of Pipaji. This is a moderate success, but it will be 15 years before it appears on Broadway, with I should probably show this one, with Mary Martin in the role of Zhao Wunyang, with the reviewers making snarky comments about how she starves to death in the most expensive robes you can imagine by Valentina, one of the most expensive designers of the day. It's a moderate success, and it goes on tour throughout the US. It was performed in between in Hawaii, and so we see that there's a particular sort of market for Asian American productions of Chinese classical theater. There's one from the 30s, there's one from the 50s for sure. Here are the costume productions. Here are some, stage bills and publicity photos from the tour. That's Yul Brynner, who later becomes cast as the King of Siam in The King and I, due to his, typecast, because he's already performed, an Asian role, and he claims dubiously Asian ancestry. He claims to know Mei Lanfang, which is definitely not the case. And it sort of, as the acceptability of yellowface, that is to say, white performers playing Chinese roles, decreases, this sort of falls out of the university and high school repertoire, where it has a certain place until 1989, in which case the Berkshire Festival, I think probably in order to sort of honor the early history of their festival, produces it one more time, with an Asian American cast, now mostly drawn from New York. So they're New York Asian American actors performing in the summer at the Berkshire Theatre Festival. and for authenticity's purpose, they hire a Taiwan-born Xiqu trained choreographer, and the gentleman and the woman that you see on the left, that's Zhou Long and Chen Yi. Zhou Long is asked to write incidental music for the production. Chen Yi is a musician. I mention them because they're now maybe the two most prominent Chinese American classical music composers. So it's interesting that really early in their careers, through the Chinese consulate in New York, they are invited to produce music for this, 1930 adaptation of a French adaptation of Pipaji. So that's the sinological route. I add here in 1870s inclusion of Pipaji in a Jesuit Latin primer. So that's, sorry, not a primer of Latin, a primer in Latin for Chinese, so that Jesuits can quickly learn Chinese. There's various scenes of Pipaji. There's a couple of sort of learn Chinese primers where they include Pipaji, partly perhaps because it was popular, partly because it was fairly easy to understand. Then we have Lutan Song, the Swedish version, so the Swedish translation of the English lute song adaptation of the American adaptation of the French adaptation of Pipaji. And here we have an Indonesian version, which is a retranslation that appeared after the ban on Chinese culture came to an end with the fall of Suharto in 1998. All right, so that's sort of one vein of it. As I've suggested, when it has the sinological root, I think it because it's not state actors and it's not from permanent migration, it's maybe a little bit more random and unpredictable in the way it feeds into local culture, the way it's sort of responded to. But it does sort of become a seminal factor in the formation of the Chinese dramatic canon, both domestically, like within China, because I think that the position, not of Pipaji perhaps, but the position of Zhao Shiguar, which is maybe not a great play, is higher. Maybe also of Huilanji is higher within China, within productions of Xiqu in China, because it's one of the early translations, and because then there's this reanalysis of the Chinese dramatic canon in the early 20th century in terms of what Westerners think is valuable in Chinese drama. But that's probably a topic for another day. All right, so let's move quickly to the diplomatic one. So we can see here the Chinese art troupe. This is a troupe. There's no troupe in the PRC usually called the Chinese art troupe. This is a sort of all-star troupe of dancers and singers, but primarily one of the major things is the Jingju performers. Some of the best Jingju performers are sent abroad, and we just before there's endless communication about when will they arrive and how will they get their visas, because there are no relations, there are no diplomatic relations between the PRC and Canada at this time, right? The Canada has relations with the ROC government, and so there is an extended internal debate in Canada. As is often the case with Canada, it's a question of how far and whether they are willing to annoy the United States by doing something that is against prevailing American foreign policy. In this case, partly because of Canadian nationalistic reasons, they do. And they get over the sort of opposition of the nationalist diplomatic representatives in Ottawa. They grant visas to the Chinese art troupe, which arrives from Cuba in a Soviet sugar steamer. And they mostly arrive due to the efforts of these two men, and the third for whom I don't have a picture. So these are the director of the Stratford Festival on the right, on the left, the director of the Vancouver International Festival. They are two of the three impresarios behind this tour. From the Canadian side are new Canadians, that is to say they are Europeans who arrive in Canada post-war, and their idea of what is world culture, what is a good festival, is based on things like Salzburg and Edinburgh. The Jingju performances in Paris and London in 1955 have already been a big splash. And so for them, since the PRC troops cannot travel to the US, it's a big coup if they can get them to Canada. And they've been lobbying the Canadian Foreign Affairs Department for years. For I think the first record I have of them lobbying is from 54. So it is 6 years until the troop was finally allowed to arrive in 1960. Very important performers arrive with it. This is Gujin Fang, who died, I think, maybe only a few weeks ago. One of the great performers of the early PRC, after 49 and before 66. And here the star Sheng, Li Xiaochun. So both of them visit Canada as part of this tour. And these are sort of pictures drawn from the booklet here, and then collected by the Canadian police, the RCMP, in order to analyze what the Chinese troop is really doing in Canada, because there's an enormous amount of anxiety from the Canadian government and the Canadian police about having PRC, it's 101 performers, so a large PRC troop traveling in Canada. And you can see here, so these are snapshots given to me by, I think, the child in white there, maybe that's his brother. But anyways, this is the Chung family of Montreal that invited the whole troop to their home and invited the neighbors in. And so you can see they're sort of having snapshots. But there is a great deal of support from the leftist Beijing-leaning parts of Chinatown, and a great deal of opposition, of course, from the especially Vancouver, Toronto, KMT-leaning community organizations. So there are pickets outside of the performances. There is a warning from New Zealand that a tour in 1956 allegedly had radicalizing effects on the local Chinese, New Zealander Chinese community. And then these ones really struck me. So these are given to me from the National Archives in Ottawa. These are police, snapshots. It's clear from some of the documents that sometimes the police has infiltrators in some of the meetings with Canadian Chinese organizations where the troop is involved. These, look to be sort of quite unguarded sort of travel snapshots, but they are in the police file. So, and without information about how they got them. And then we have other pictures. Let me see if I have them here. No, other pictures sort of in the train station and stuff like that with numbers on them saying, well, this is Li Xiaochun, this is Gujin Fang, this is Chen Zhongqing, the head of the troop. And there are flyers handed out reminding Canadians of the Catholic nuns who had been imprisoned in 1950, especially in Quebec, where Catholicism at the time still remains a major social and political force. And then these pickets, then there are notes put under the door encouraging the performers to defect, and other political messages from KMT supporters, but also then these responses from the troop. So Chen Zhongjing, goes to visit hospitals associated with Norman Bethune to emphasize Chinese-Canadian friendship. These, $3,000 at the time is no small amount of money, and it is donated to help the victims of a fire in Nanaimo, Chinatown on Vancouver Island. And then these messages of sort of support and solidarity with the overseas Chinese. So there's sort of four parties. I'm still working on this tour. There's an enormous, thousands of pages of material from the National Archive. But I wanted to point out that, so when it comes on this diplomatic route, it is instantly a political issue. It becomes a political issue for the festivals that want to show that they are not afraid of the communist bloc, that they welcome not only the Soviet troops have already been in Canada at that time, it's a way for Canadian festivals of attracting American audiences as well, who cross the border to see communist performers from communist countries that they cannot see in the US. But then it's also the beginning. So this is 1960, Canada recognizes the PRC 10 years later in 1970. And from the sort of internal documentation, we can see that this is the beginning before there's really a large amount of trade with the PRC. The first thing that the country is willing to do is to have a cultural exchange of this kind and to invite the troupe to operate. And so I just, as I say, I'm just going through sort of types of modes of performance. I give this example so that there are countries, I think, where the dominant way of experiencing Chinese theater is probably through these diplomatic modes, and where then instantly a lot of the surrounding events, a lot of coverage in the newspapers, a lot of people remember about it later, is about the foreign relations, the diplomatic, the political side of the performance. For instance, of course, the cultural journalists and do talk, do comment on the performances themselves, but compared to, say, the reception of, the sinological reception of Bazin's translation of Pipaji, which is entirely sort of in this intellectual culture and letters area, if it comes through diplomatic channels, the sort of discipline that it ends up landing in, if we're studying it, is politics and foreign relations rather than letters and theater studies, at least a lot of the time. Even though I think it's probably an important question what it was they were performing, what repertoire they thought was most appropriate for foreign audiences. The Canadians actually were so intent on repeating the successes of Paris and London that they stipulated in the contract that it had to be the same repertoire, it had to be the same shows as had been shown in London and Paris, which doesn't say much for Canadian self-confidence when it comes to cultural matters, that even on such a matter they had to follow a lead coming from London and Paris. However, that is of interest probably primarily to Canadians. And so we pass to migration. And so I think Professor Hong, I read at the beginning, mentioned the question of non-Chinese or maybe mixed Chinese and non-Chinese performance of Chinese theater. And I think that's one of the areas that, especially in China, tends to really interest people. Of course, we saw, non-Chinese performers performing lute song earlier, the pictures. But this is really an interesting case to me, and I think to a lot of people. And we find some similarities in Philippines, in Thailand, in Vietnam, where a genre becomes really heavily identified as belonging to this host country, rather than being a Chinese, a 中国, a Chinese genre, right? So people will recognize that it is a 中华 origin, keturunan Tionghoa, that sort of thing. They will recognize that it has its roots there, but really the political tendency in Indonesia, both from the patrons and the performers, and I think a lot of the academics, is to place it as the Chinese contribution to wayang. Wayang being, most people will be familiar with it as piyingxi, right? As this Indonesian, very famous leather puppet screen, behind a screen form of puppetry, really also become sort of a national symbol of Indonesia. But really the term wayang is quite expansive, and there's different forms of wayang, not all of them involving leather puppets. Some of them are wood puppets, some of them indeed are scrolls rather than puppets. And so the way that it's been increasingly formulated, this genre here, is as the Chinese contribution to wayang. The migration to Southeast Asia between the mid-19th century and the mid-20th century is, of course, enormous. And so in Indonesia, and it's the period where we will both have some record of what kind of theater they are performing, and a period where we can be certain that almost everybody who moves abroad is either bringing their theater or is hosting visits from theater companies coming from the Chinese world. There's a lot of sort of secondary stuff, secondary sort of touring, in the sense that in some periods, the performances in Medan, if you can see there in northwestern, or rather the northeastern coast of Sumatra and Medan, some of those performances of Chinese theater might be coming from Thailand or from Penang or from Singapore, as well as from Fujian or Chaozhou. So you can see here in the way that it is promoted by the Sino-Indonesian, that is to say the Tionghoa, the Chinese descendants in Indonesia, as a Indonesian genre. Here it is in a Surabaya mall, explicitly Indonesia for the world. And here in an art gallery, again being represented as an Indonesian, specifically Indonesian art. Its origins are of, I think many of you will have recognized, in Budaishi. So Budaishi, Potahi is the Hokkien, is the Indonesianized form of the Hokkien pronunciation of Budaishi. We find it in, historically, really, it was in Manila, it was in Yangon, in all these places where you see it now in red in Indonesia. It remains in Penang in Singapore, and central and eastern Java. The first known site of Potahi in Indonesia, if we can trust our sources, they're pretty good sources, is the late 18th century, in this temple that is still standing in Semarang. Here is one of the most famous puppeteers, famous also because he was able to perform before and after the ban on Chinese culture, that sort of marks Chinese existence in Indonesia during the Suharto years. And so he begins his career performing entirely in Hokkien to very largely Chinese audiences, although also to mixed audiences in festival sort of situations, and ends his career performing to very mixed groups of mostly children, rather than the earlier sort of ritual audiences we would expect, performing entirely, almost entirely in Indonesian, except for certain sort of incantations. The centers of Potahi, of Wayang Potahi, are now in these cities: Semarang, Surabaya, Mojokerto, Budo, and Tulungagung. The stages and the puppets now are also made in these places, and in many ways it is a more traditional way of performing than what you see in Fujian or in Taiwan. In Fujian, I think it's fair to say, you often see rather shorter performances. They are often directed at school children or at tourists. There's a lot of emphasis on sort of funny technique. Many of you will be familiar with the development of Potahi in Taiwan, where it becomes, among other things, a major sort of television and later also cinematic and cosplay kind of genre, also with an aesthetic where the puppets become much larger and influenced also by anime and other aspects of Japanese culture. So it's really an interesting genre because really within 100 years, all of these groups, which think of themselves as in one way or another continuing tradition between Fujian and Taiwan and Penang and Singapore and Java, all go off in very different directions. So what we see here traditionally, which we no longer see in Fujian, for instance, which now uses mostly curtains, we see the raised stage that you have to walk up from behind. We see that it is in a temple and is directed at the god, and it is likely to perform a narrative. The most popular narrative is Xue Rengui, Xi Jinghui. So the Xue Rengui, 学员归正西，学员归正东, fighting against the Tibetans and the Koreans. And it's performed every afternoon, for instance, from the birthday of the main deity in the temple for 40 afternoons. And then there's a break, and then there's 40 evenings that perform a different narrative. And so that sort of longer ritual style of performance is maintained in Indonesia, but so in that way it looks, very traditional. But in other ways, the fact that it is no longer in a Chinese language, the fact that it is the fact that it is performed not by ethnic Chinese. Most of the time, the dalang, the puppeteer, the main puppeteer, are not ethnic Chinese. I think now there are no longer any living ethnic Chinese puppeteers in this genre. So you see, from that perspective, it's performed in a Chinese temple, sponsored by Chinese community members, but in Indonesian by Indonesian artists, ethnic Indonesia, well, ethnic Javanese, non-Chinese. So that's sort of an interesting aspect for many, I think, researchers, and also particularly from a Chinese perspective, these Chinese narratives that divest themselves of some aspects of ethnicity and identity, while retaining narrative aspects and material aspects and sort of performance context aspects. So you can see it's temple-based performance. Here's the backstage at Gudo. There are a few Chinese musicians, ethnic Chinese musicians, but most of the musicians also are Javanese. Many of them Muslim. And these here I'm just showing other aspects of the tradition. So often you ask the deity which show he would like to see, and that's so using the Puapui sort of divination. That's how you know which performance should be done. Here is I include the picture on the right because there's nobody watching. It is only for the deity, and so that sort of ritual socioeconomic basis for theater is something quite traditional. But at the same time, we see in the patronage system this willingness to use Potahi to go into the villages and represent Chinese culture to poor Indonesians in villages who might have no contact with it and might have stereotypes about the ethnic Chinese. And so ethnic Chinese patrons will will hire Potahi, so Javanese Potahi performers, to go into the villages in the area which have no ethnic Chinese inhabitants, to perform Potahi shows as a gift, often with a tricycle, for instance, being raffled off on one occasion, but also with enormous display of Indonesian flags, and of songs about being Sino-Indonesian, that is, being ethnic Chinese, but very loyal to Indonesia. And here on the left, you can see that the puppeteer is holding a puppet of Gus Dur, who is the president of Indonesia, who abolished the Suharto-era anti-Chinese laws, so Abdurrahman Wahid, who is being represented as a hero in puppet form. Here we can see the former First Lady, Ani Yudhoyono, visiting a Potahi stage, the mayor of one of the cities where Potahi is cited with the puppetry. So there's really a sort of an overt decision by local Chinese communities to use the presence of this puppetry form as a symbol, as a contribution of local Chinese community to Indonesian culture, to Wayang specifically. And you can see that it's sort of there countersided by the American consulate in Surabaya, I believe, using it also as a cultural diversity symbol. Here you can see the Potahi puppets with Indonesian flags, and here outreach into schools. So again, being represented as part of a Javanese culture in a school to non-Chinese children, and here on the right in a mall in Jakarta. I wanted to finish with this interesting project, Rumah Chinwa. So Rumah Chinwa is a Universitas Indonesia, widely regarded as I think indisputably the best university the national university in Indonesia. So it's not the Chinese department, it is the Javanese department that has, or faculty in the Javanese department that have put together this troupe with the last time I visited them, no ethnic Chinese members, but performing Potehi, but increasingly making their own puppets that are not designed after Chinese models, other Potehi models, and telling stories that are Javanese of origin, and then mixing it up sort of musically. So what remains then is the stage, the sort of scale, some of the music. Sometimes they do Chinese stories, sometimes they do Javanese stories, but the composition of it of the students and of the faculty that founded it is entirely non-Chinese. But then I don't know that they're sponsored by the Chinese community, but certainly often invited and welcomed by the Jakarta Chinese community. So there's an acknowledgement and an approval of their activities. I think because it lies along the sort of the same line, the idea that Potahi is a Chinese contribution to Indonesian culture. So if non-Chinese Indonesians are adopting it, that's all to the good. And here you can see another Potahi with the Indonesian flag. I'll skip through that one. But I wanted to point out that when we get migration, we get it at a more sort of, I think more at a basic sort of community level. We find that it is more likely to be identified as an accessible local type of culture. The specific type of opera that comes to a certain place. So in Java, it was mostly these Hokkien forms. The puppet form is the one that survived. In Sumatra, it was also a Hokkien form, a Goahi form that also survived. But we find, I think maybe when it comes through migration, again, as you would sort of expect, you get a lot more acculturation, a lot more hybridity, a lot more maybe adoption from the local communities. These are older migrations in some ways. So like the Southeast Asian migrations are the newest Southeast Asian migrations, large Southeast Asian migrations of Chinese to Southeast Asia, coincide with like the older side of the migration to the Americas, to Latin America, and also to Australasia. And so maybe we can think that these migration avenues are more likely to lead to hybridity and acculturation and sort of adoption as a contribution to local culture. Perhaps we can be optimistic that more of that is coming in the Western Anglo-Saxon settler colonial states. Perhaps that is too optimistic. But anyways, I just wanted, the thought that I'm sharing with you today, and that hopefully you will give me some feedback on, and perhaps was of interest, is that whether we find it in a diplomatic register, or whether we find it in the sinological register, or whether we find it in the migration register, that's going to be different, of course, also over time, but also going to be different depending on the locale. We just aren't going to see that migrant history of theater on the same scale, certainly, that we see in Indonesia or in the Philippines or in Thailand, in a place like France, where the reception then is a mix of the sinological and the diplomatic, and then I think makes more of an attempt to align itself, to identify itself as sort of the Chinese equivalent of opera. Also why we get the term Chinese opera, right? Because it's an attempt, I think, not necessarily as early as people sometimes assume, an attempt to give it that equivalence. The move to Japan, about which I know a lot less, but I'm working with scholars in Japan to try and figure out where that might fit in, is also not going to be dominated by the migration side, but is going to be very heavy from both the sinological side and then later from the diplomatic side. And so where I'm at the present is the idea that this certain strain, the certain composition of which strain, which mode of performance that arrives in a certain place is likely to ultimately have knock-on effects on how Chinese culture appears once it is abroad. And one of the examples, the reason I've written Mei Lan Fang versus Cantonese opera there, is because when Mei Lan Fang visits a place like New York in 1930, of course, not only New York, but also California, both of which have living popular Cantonese opera performances at that time, they are, you can see from the documents around the performance, that they are very concerned to dissociate themselves with the Cantonese opera, right? They want Americans, they want white Americans to understand that they are the proper classical opera, and that the Cantonese opera is not part of the same thing. That they shouldn't be associated with them, that they shouldn't be judged with them, which makes it awkward I think for some of the Chinese Americans who are excited to have Mei Lan Fang there representing classical Chinese culture, but who are themselves Cantonese. So I think there's sort of little traces of that in that particular trip that really shows how the cultural diplomacy and the migrant side and the sinological strain might produce different visions, different results for Chinese culture. So I'd like to thank you all for indulging me in this whirlwind trip through various areas of my current interest. I hope that some of the connections made sense to you, and I welcome questions and comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh, for this wonderful and indeed a kaleidoscopic picture of the circulation of Chinese performing arts, right, in multiple genres. Among many things, I think a very important takeaway for me personally is how all of these changes in terms of not just genre, okay, the length, which you also mentioned at the very beginning, talking about the French translation, right, the medium of public display, as well as the change in performance, and the constituencies, right, of audience. I think all of these changes to me suggest in a way that pushes us to think about what you mentioned as the notion of, or the question of translation, or what we need to do perhaps when we think about the concept of translation, or perhaps indeed not just translation but a kind of rewriting or remake. So I myself have a lot of questions, but I'm sure that audiences also have a lot of questions. So I think I would like to in fact go directly to some of the initial questions that I already see from our audience. So perhaps we could answer a first few questions, and then we can go to the second round. So perhaps for the first round, I see that there is a question from Zoe that I think is both specific because she is using Voltaire's adaptation of 赵氏孤儿 as an example, but she is also gesturing toward some broader questions. So perhaps I'll just invite Zoe to ask the question by herself directly, and then following Zoe's question, I would like to invite Hui Yun, our colleague from NYU Shanghai, to ask the question by herself. So Hui Yun, you will be the next. But Zoe, you go first.
Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, I really love your presentation. It's so detailed in a way to take this historical scope and see the different stages in the history, how Chinese drama is being adapted and also transferred into different societies. I really love it. I think my question is more about the spectatorship or the audience group of all those various versions of adaptations, because I think I've learned a little bit about Voltaire's adaptation of Zhao Shiguar because it's under the social consciousness of enlightenment. So he's trying to challenge the French aristocracy using this reference from another civilization. That's just my understanding. And I definitely see these socio-political elements got enlarged in a later diplomatic phase, because this definitely has a very variety of political rules. So I wonder how this spectatorship changed in that, or how do people make sense of these Chinese dramas in relation to their own lives or societies? Yeah, I'm really curious about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, both for the question and for your kind words about the presentation. I'm glad it was of interest to you and maybe useful to you. And the audience is a perpetual headache really for people in theater studies as well, because our sources for them are so random and unreliable, and sometimes people write things in their diaries, and if it's a bit later in the right society, then maybe we have newspaper reports. The most frustrating thing about Chinese drama a lot of the time is somebody went to see something in Jakarta and they write, it was very noisy, and you're like, what did you see? What was the tell me something about it, right? But a lot of the colonial, especially the colonial ones, are just they're useful for telling us about colonial attitudes, but and then sometimes you'll find somebody who made a beautiful sketch, and you're like, even if they didn't know a lot about Chinese theater, you find a lot of information from the sketch, or some of the incredible photos from colonial Dutch East Indies. Anyway, So you know, what are the responses of the audience? Obviously, I think it depends a lot on the particular um, uh, society and product that we're looking at. I think the response to the Bazin translation was really a welcome to a substantial extent of what they reckoned was the best work of Chinese drama that they knew yet. I think a lot of the sort of newspaper reports of as a response, or reviews as a response to Bazin, are genuinely interested in, you know, how Chinese drama fits. They necessarily, I mean, unsurprisingly, have also a lot of arrogance about assumptions of where Asian theater sits vis-a-vis European theater, right? They assume that classical theater and then Western European theater stand above all. But the willingness and the idea to try and make a global idea of theater and drama, and actually one of the Macaulay Posnett, who is that right? Macaulay Hutchison Posnett, who coins the term comparative literature, actually writes a little piece on Pipaji and says, and he writes it in 1900, and his point of reference is the Boxer Rebellion. And he says, you know, these people whose theater we can read are, you know, are performing human situations. You know, Pipaji is in some ways, for Europeans, it looks like a love triangle. So they, you know, he makes the argument that we can't have the imperialism of the Boxer Rebellion because Pipaji, right? He derives a humanist argument about British imperial policy. I should say he's Irish, so you know, there's other reasons he might be against British imperial policy. But he derives that from Pipaji and applies it to the suppression of the, you know, the Bagua Lianjun moment of the Boxer Rebellion. So I think that's you know, people, as you say, as your example for Voltaire shows, you know, people use it for their own devices in terms of both foreign relations and domestic politics. But I think I should probably move on to the next question.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on behalf of Victor, okay, who in his written question asked about is there any reason why Bazin decided to remove so much of Pipaji's content, and whether he agrees with this progressive conception of Chinese theater, since we're talking about Pipaji?
Yeah. As I said, I think it's a great PhD project to really figure it out, because it isn't entirely clear to me what the principles are. I think he does say why he reminds so much of it. I mean, if you read Shichu, it does repeat itself, right? People do tend to, in scene 25, they tell you what happened in scene 10. And you're like, well, I read scene 10, you know? So you can see that if you're familiar with Shichu, that probably that sense of repetition and maybe filler scenes, you know, examination scenes often sort of resemble each other, that sort of thing. So he wants to condense because he thinks that's a better literary form. I also think he wants to bring out what for him is a love triangle. He wants to emphasize the emotional side between Zhao Wenyang and Cai Bojie. I think he wants to make it more. He can't make it as short as a French play, but he can put it in that direction. I think he's also concerned that if he writes it too long, then fewer people, like a publisher now might think, then fewer people will read it. So he wants to, and he also, another thing that he's interested in, that the French commentators of this era are also interested in general, is like, is it a tragedy? Can it be a tragedy? Because they think generally that the highest form of theater should be a tragedy. And so the position of Chinese drama is going to depend on whether there are tragedies. And I think that also accounts for the high position of Zhao Shiguar and maybe Dou Yuan, although Dou Yuan is a much better play.
Okay, thank you. And now I will invite Huiyan, our colleague, to ask the question, to unmute, and then afterward I will read a couple of questions from the written comments among our audience on their behalf. Then I will invite Tristan, okay, to ask the question himself. I think Haojia, you probably need to help Huiyan unmute, or perhaps Huiyan can unmute your microphone. Huiyan, you need to unmute your microphone. Is there any way we can do that, from the background, Haojia?
We have already allowed Huiyan to ask, but
okay.
yes.
Okay, in that case, actually, let me perhaps go to the next batch of questions first, and perhaps we could come back to Huiyan. Okay.
You're muted. You're muted again.
Mute. Right. Okay, thank you. So I see two very interesting questions from our students that I think are somewhat interrelated, perhaps not in, I don't know whether that's why they asked the question, but one question from Chris has to do with cultural appropriation. So the question is whether you see any cultural appropriation around the spread of Chinese drama and classical theater. Are these things taken into consideration by either the actors or Chinese audiences who are present, which I think to some extent relates to your earlier comments about yellow face performance, right? I wonder if we could situate that a little bit, okay, within the context of the Chinese exclusion period in North America, but also the whole discourse of the yellow peril, right, around the same period. And another related question, which is from Sinead, that also touches on Chinese Americans. So I'll ask that question, I'll read that question on her behalf as well. So how did the introduction of Chinese and Chinese American performers and music producers in Chinese opera in the US change the perception and treatment of Chinese people in the country? So yeah, I think that these questions seem to be related.
Yeah, and both fascinating questions that I won't be able to do justice to, in the time that we have, and I'm not necessarily the right person to give the best answer to these questions of sort of American cultural history and migration history, but I'll give it a stab. I think Chris's question is really closely sort of connected to Lute Song. Lute Song's a really interesting one because unlike certain productions of China, which really are about mocking a certain vision of Asia, or sort of casually using China as a backdrop, as sort of fantasy. Here, maybe not American, but if you look at Turandot, right, if you know that opera, the Puccini opera, it just, it's a fairy tale China. It has no connection with Chinese people. It's not based on a Chinese story. And so I think it is important to make a distinction with Lute Song, which is created by Irwin because he was fascinated by Cantonese opera, and because he loved the story and then used a translation adaptation of the story, right? I think there is a distinction to be made between at least the intention. The result is still Yellowface, which is an enormous, block for anybody of our period, because it's completely unacceptable now. Lute Song is an interesting one because so I interviewed for the performers of the 89 one, right? They were young then. They're all, most of them are still performers now. And they really appreciated Lute Song because American producers, Broadway producers, weren't going to cast them in Carousel or Oklahoma or, My Fair Lady. And so they were very keen on shows that were about Asia and that had pretty much all Asian cast, right? Everybody in Pipaji is supposed to be Chinese. And so what's really interesting is that it gets picked up in Hawaii, right? There's all these productions in Hawaii because Hawaii has this enormous Asian American proportion of population, and because it's one of the very few shows that just gives, the major roles automatically, so to speak, to Asian performers. You can imagine how in the cultural moment of the 50s or 60s, nowadays, of course, you will have efforts to cast more broadly, and you will certainly have all kinds of appearances of people or races of people performing in Oklahoma or Carousel or whatever is the American canon, right? That will certainly be at least an effort made by certain companies, and then there are all sorts of Asian American companies that do an enormous range of things. But that whole production of Asian American theater, both in terms of the troupes and in terms of the scripts, is later. And so I thought it was really interesting that for that later generation, for that generation who are now sort of middle-aged, who are young in the 80s, it was important just to have that kind of script. Another one that's sort of similar is Flower Drum Song, which is set among mostly Japanese Americans in Chinatown and gave a lot of roles to Asian American musical comedy actors. But yeah, the idea of cultural appropriation is after Irwin's time, for instance, right? There's no, Irwin has no inhibition at all of taking the story, setting in China and say, hey, it's a great story from China. Let's make it happen on Broadway. And all of the obstacles, the reason that it takes a long time before it is actually performed, has nothing to do with anybody's inhibitions or worries about depicting Asian people on stage. It's all about, will it be profitable? They write Broadway songs. If you're interested, you can watch Mary Martin perform one of the songs, which then goes on to have a little jazz career called Mountain High, Valley Low. Eartha Kitt records it. It's, but its origin is as a lute song for Pipaji. Yeah, so depends on depends on how you want to frame cultural appropriation. It wouldn't have been on the minds of anybody involved at the time, but you could certainly, write a historical account of American cultural appropriation of Asia and include lute song in a prominent place.
Okay, thank you, Josh, for the comment. Huiyan, would you like to try and unmute again? See if it works this time? Okay, so let me hand the virtual microphone, okay, to Tristan first, and we'll come back to Huiyan, okay, later. And I have a couple of questions that I will also read and synthesize later. Okay, these are specific questions about forms of performance. So I will read those questions on their behalf. But Tristan, you can go ahead now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very detailed, very organized, and very digestible for someone, especially like myself, who has no background in this kind of field. But I'll get to my question here. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that Siju has very distinct characteristics that perhaps, while within China may be more widely recognized, understood, and appreciated, may not be so well understood outside of China. And considering that many translations of Xiju, were performed in languages other than Chinese and by non-Chinese actors, do you think that the cultural value of Xiju as a distinctly Chinese product is changed or, quote, I guess, decreased in any significant fashion? And then additionally, and somewhat connected to the first question, if the language and actors are interchangeable, even simply to make the production possible for foreign audiences, what other signifying aspects are also malleable, perhaps to better accommodate local culture or better appeal to local audiences, or even to fit, quote, Western views and understandings of what Xiju is, regardless of actual authenticity?
Thanks. That's a complex question, and I hope I keep it straight in my mind long enough to produce a useful answer. So within China, this is sort of a perpetual problem in sort of communicating about Chinese culture, I think, because within China, I wouldn't usually need to explain the difference between, say, Kunqu and Gezaixi, or between Jingju and Guangdong Yueju, right? Even people who don't watch theater at all have some kind of information to kind of put under these categories. Also, if I make reference to role types, for instance, or if I, maybe people don't know the plot of Pipaji, but they kind of know there is a Pipaji. That sort of background stuff all disappears when you're trying to talk about Chinese culture outside of a Chinese world, or especially in another language. And so I was trying to suggest maybe not that Xiju has these really hard boundaries, because I think when you look at Xiju, it even within the sort of state categories of genres, there's a bit of slippage, right? So everybody can agree that Jingju or Kunju are definitely Xiju. But then you get these things that are like, what is it called? Huaji Xi, right? And I was just looking at sort of stuff from the 80s, sort of, comic theater stuff. And I remember also in maybe around the year 2000 that this sort of comic Xiju genre, this comic genre was classified as Xiju, was in Xiju festivals and stuff. But when you go to see it, it's like, well, I don't really know it's not Chinese opera. It doesn't share that many characteristics. Or if we think about the place between genres, so that if we think, like it's not clear to me really that in 1850 it mattered very much to people whether you sang kunqu or whether you sang, Pihuang. What mattered was that the show was good, and there were a lot of performers, and there still are some performers who can do more than one genre, more than one role type. I think the fact of bureaucracy, the fact of the sort of classification and categorization of modernity, not only in the PRC, but also you see it also in the sort of definition of genres in places like Singapore or Indonesia, that sort of creates harder edges around everything, where previously it might have been quite fluid whether these sort of storytelling genres are Xiju, whether puppetry genres are Xiju. So my suspicion is that whole category and all these genres within it are hardened by the shock of the contact with the West, right? When you get the new category of Huaju and the new category of Geju, right, of Western opera, then we need a new definition of what previously was just Xi, right? Was previously was just theater, and then we get Xiqu as that definition, as that category of things that are now going to be called Chinese opera, because there's another kind of theater, because there's another kind of opera. And actually, I think at its root, a lot of these practices were very malleable. If you look at it in the late imperial period, I'm convinced that a lot of the time, unless we're at court, unless we're in front of high officials, a lot of the time people are performing for what they think will sell. They're performing for what they think the audience wants. They think they're performing for the stories that are popular in a certain region. And then at a higher level, they're performing, for what they think the sovereign wants, what they think the court wants, what they think the high mandarins appreciate. But that also has at its base a sort of socioeconomic foundation. And so that puts me offside vis-a-vis a lot of other people's conception of Xiju, right? I'm speaking for myself. But that means that I'm quite accepting of all kinds of malleability, all kinds of exchanges, it doesn't particularly bother me. I don't have a big issue around, for instance, cultural appropriation if I see Indonesians, deciding that they're going to perform Potahi. Partly because I don't see anybody in Indonesia objecting to it, right? The Chinese community thinks it's great. The students like it. So it's, it 轮不到我, right? Like it's not for me to say in the first place. But I do think we have to consider, whether a question like, is it allowed, and does that cultural appropriation? The cultural appropriation is a pretty specific discourse to. And for good reason, to colonial settler states, mostly of the Anglo-Saxon history. But it doesn't at all translate to the question of Wayang Potahi, for instance. I'm sure that wasn't much of an answer to your question, but.
Thank you, Josh, for the comments. So here I have, two very specific questions from the audience, and I'll synthesize those questions. Then I will synthesize another batch of questions that I think are similar and broader, that touches on conceptual issues. So the two questions that I'm referring to, but the first one has to do with Buabui. So Fiona wants to know about whether the practice of Buabui using this. How do I call this?
Divination blocks.
Yeah, it's a divinational kind of wooden stick, right? Is it still practiced in these theater groups? And perhaps, I think she was interested in knowing about the ritualistic aspect of it. And another question, which is also, I think, quite interesting and very specific, comes from Lily Yao, who wants to know, who said that she found it particularly interesting when you mentioned that Potahi characters had bigger heads due to anime and some influence from the Japanese. So she was wondering how exactly the Potahi stage was influenced by Japanese culture as well as other Southeast Asian countries.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll start with the Buapui. So Jean-Ray didn't talk about really is these Sumatra Guahi Gezaishi performance. So Hokkien theater in the city of Palembang, which sort of survived the anti-Chinese laws of the Suharto era by coming to an arrangement with local authorities and police, and never really stopped. Everywhere else sort of stopped doing every form of Chinese opera that wasn't puppetry, and they didn't. It was sort of out of the way enough. And they did it at temples. And so when I visited them a couple of years ago, the practice of the temples was to ask the divinity through Buapui whether they, not only what shows they wanted to see, but whether they wanted Guahi or whether they wanted karaoke, whether they wanted sort of racy karaoke. Which is another sort of good high performance that you get in Sumatra and also in Malaysia. So the deities were asked sometimes not only whether they want, what genre they wanted, right? Did they want, and the historical records suggest that it used to also be the case that they were asked, did they want the, Da Xi or the Budai Xi, right? Do they want the people, actors, or do they want the puppets? Nowadays, as relating to the Potahi, I know that they are asked, the deities are asked what show, like what narrative they want, because it's their birthday, right? So it's their birthday and they're going to be watching something for 40 days. And mostly it's only them who's going to be watching. Like on the 20th day, there's usually nobody there except the performers, the deity, and maybe me, writing about it. So yeah, it's up to them to sort of decide. There's only so many performances that, only so many narratives that are in repertoire for a particular troupe. But yeah, very much still the practice for both Gozaishi and Budaishi. For Lillian Yao's question, I've probably not expressed myself clearly enough. What I was trying to say there, when I mentioned the anime and the sort of larger heads and stuff, what I was trying to suggest is that, so living forms of Budaishi, Potahi, right? We have one in Fujian, various troops there. We have an enormous popularity of it in Taiwan. We have a couple of troops in Penang, which are marked by the fact that they do Guzaishi music rather than what we usually get for Budaishi. And there's one troop, I think only one troop in Singapore. And then there's the Indonesian troops. There's sort of 4 or 5 troops in Indonesia, and they travel and they visit other places. But basically, there's sort of 4 or 5 outfits. What I was suggesting is that these 5 groups all in one way or another think of themselves as traditional and deriving from something, not that long ago, let's say late Qing, right? Although there's also origin stories that go earlier, but the point of division, right? The point when one goes to Malaysia and one goes to Singapore, that's sort of late 19th century, if we look at their lineages. Even the ones in Taiwan, we don't have really strong evidence for lineages of Budaishi before the 19th century. So what I was trying to suggest is that they all kind of go their different ways. In China, in Fujian, we tend to see sort of the curtain, a little bit very entertaining, but directed at children. In Penang, we get this sort of guzaixi. It's mostly retired guzaixi performers, and they do some repertoire that you don't see anywhere else. They do, for instance, mudanting, which is kind of hard to imagine being done in Fujian. In Indonesia, it's done in Indonesian. And the one in Taiwan has, the sort of pili budaishi that kind of develops out of it, with its enormous puppets and great heads and the sort of aquiline aesthetics of their carved heads, I think are generally felt, especially the way that it's filmed, right? They have a whole television channel of just pili budaishi, and the way that it's filmed, I think everybody, and the fact that it has a cosplay expression, generally is felt to be to some degree an influence from Japanese aesthetics. You could also mention, like, during the Huangminhua, the Kominka movement, in the later period of Japanese colonization of Taiwan, they are forced to do, the Budaishi troops are forced to do Japanese stories in Japanese using Budaishi. And then in the 50s, of course, they have to do Kuomintang, anti-communist stories, right? So, and they're not allowed to do them in Minanhua, right? They have to do them in Mandarin. So yeah, I tend to use that example because they all think, they all consider themselves as continuing a tradition, but we have to ask ourselves, like, well, traditions have a lot of moving parts, and in the process of transmission, you end up having 5 genres that appear to be wildly different, but in some meaningful way are related, are all Budaishi.
Thank you, Josh, for the rich comments to these very specific questions. So why don't we take the last batch of questions? So I will first synthesize a few from Mia, from Sophia, and Muchen, who are, I think, broadly concerned with the effects, the global effects of Chinese drama and theater, and perhaps of the impacts, and perhaps the future, the future prospects, if we're thinking about where Chinese performing arts are going toward in the future. So specifically, Mia is asking, have we seen any historical effects translated into realms like Chinese cinema? You already mentioned how the pili Potahi translated, right, to television, to cinema. So I think that might be one example. But coming from Sophia, okay, she was asking what the future of Chinese drama scholarship might look like in the coming years, and particularly with the impacts on coming from COVID, quarantine, and what happened last year, and the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese hatred, and related crimes going on, which I think is what Muchen was also gesturing toward in his question. Specifically, he said, against the backdrop of heightening hatred and racism against the Asian community, do you think the future of Chinese drama and theater would be greatly affected by the ongoing pandemic? And before you answer this batch of questions, let me also invite Johnny to ask his question directly. I think he's also concerned with a similar issue, but he is probably more interested in knowing about, for example, how we think of the question of perhaps on cultural inheritance, and perhaps how we pass on this cultural heritage from generation to generation. But Johnny, I'll let you wrap up this batch of questions, because you know most clearly what you have in mind. So Johnny, go ahead.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for your presentation. Well, my question is that with the advent of other sources of entertainment from Western media, for example, Chinese opera then faces a potential decrease in viewership or demand from the overseas Chinese communities. Like, I was thinking, like, potential barriers for this that include the inability to understand the play's dialogue or the arias that are like the performers are singing throughout the performance, or they personally may not like the musical composition of Chinese opera. Like you mentioned before, like some of them were complaining because it's too noisy and like it kind of like defeats the meaning of the whole Chinese opera and what they're trying to portray through the performance. So I'm wondering which of the avenues you have mentioned would be the best to motivate the preservation of the Chinese cultural heritage for these migrant communities.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the other posers of questions, questioners, I don't know. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not much of a soothsayer or prophet. And so all of the ones about, where do I see it going in future is, I'm always wrong. So about what will happen in the future. So, take what I say with a grain of salt. A lot of, I should say first that a lot of the places where Chinese theater is performed, such as, China, Singapore, have gone back to, I don't know, I'm speaking to you from Australia, which also has a lively theater world, but I'm from Canada and I'm just acutely aware that a lot of Europe and a lot of North America still isn't going to the theater, right? So, if we look at where Chinese opera is in terms of pandemic, I'm quite jealous of all the performances that I see happening in Shanghai and Nanjing and Taipei and Singapore and Hong Kong, and it's a genre or a family of genres that is less badly hit than a lot of other theater genres, and as also I think adapted pretty well. There was a long period where I think it would be fair to say that Xiqu performers were not very technologically literate. And for a long time, you had to be in Nanjing to see somebody or to hear somebody. And of course, there's a lot of value to that personal contact with teachers. And, I think it's important to see performances live. But when you can't, I've also just been impressed in how many performers now are teaching online, how many performances are streamed online, how many troops and fans have made their sort of archive available online. So compared to other historical periods, it's a lot easier. One of the questions mentioned cinema. When I first started getting interested in Chinese cinema, you would occasionally see these great Xiqu movies on TV, and it'd be murder to try and actually get a copy of them, right? It's very hard to do research on cinema when you can't get a copy of something. But now they are all, not only are they all on, Bilibili, but they're all on YouTube as well. And so another great PhD dissertation, which I'm waiting for somebody to do, is on the Xiqu movie, because actually the first movie in Taiwan, the first movie in mainland China, the first movie in Hong Kong, they are all related to Xiqu. Xiqu is extremely seminal in the early history of Chinese language cinema, and remains really important right through the 80s. I would say, there's still an important presence on television, but as a cinematic form, there's big budget productions right through the 80s, and then you just seldom see there's really not a large amount of work on it yet, especially in English. So and it's interesting to see how what we can tell of the stage history, how that relates to the cinema history. That is to say, things that were okay on the stage sometimes had to be adapted or tweaked or often shortened, right? The movie is just a lot shorter than your typical Xiqu performance is. And I think that another effect, those of you who do watch some Xiqu will know that one of the traditional ways of performing in a lot of genres is 折子戏, right? You do these scenes, right? You do half an hour of this plot, half an hour of Pipaji followed by half an hour of Mudanting, the highlights, right? Xiqu texts are really long. And I think that move, which now is dominant, to do one play on one setting, right? You go to the theater and they're doing Changxingdian, and tomorrow they're doing Mudanting, and then after that they're doing Xixiangji. I think that's partly from cinema, right? That move where rather than expansive or highlight-based theater to the single sitting theater is probably something that comes from cinema. All right, where do I see Chinese drama scholarship going in future? I look forward. There's been some fantastic recent publications of people working on transnational aspects, including Southeast Asia. There are fantastic colleagues in Singapore, in Macau, in Taiwan, in Xiamen, in Nanjing, who are, I mean, just the level of bilingualism, multilingualism has really risen in the last generation, I think, throughout Asia. And so the amount of people who are able to look at Chinese to French or Chinese to German or Chinese to Thai or Malay to Chinese, there's a lot more work available to be doing in that space. Now, a lot of that will be historical. For those of you concerned in where does performance go? Sort of where does scholarship go and where do performance go aren't altogether the same question. And where the questions related to racism and where I think particularly the Western settler societies are at this point also play into this, because I think particularly around the diplomatic side, the soft power side, right? I mean, it's very much promoted, it's very encouraged, and you can see, and I've been working in Chinese theater in Quincy for such a long time. I appreciate it when the state supports theater and supports making it available abroad. But I do think that there are that in a moment, in a historical moment where there is a substantial risk of anti-Chinese sentiment in a lot of Western countries, and not only in Western countries, all of those soft power initiatives have to manage with care the local situation, especially, I mean, I think probably you guys are more aware maybe of the English-speaking world than, for instance, Indonesia or Myanmar. But and I hate to say it, but anti-Chinese violence in Indonesia or Myanmar is reasonably recent, right? It's within living memory. And so the actions of the state of cultural diplomacy in areas like that really have to think hard about the welfare of ethnic Chinese in those places, because they can be vulnerable and have been vulnerable in the past.
Thank you so much, Josh, for answering so many questions from our audience members, and for giving us very nuanced, I think, comments on all of these questions that seem to be also open-ended, right? That do not have any easy answers. And so I think that is one of the most important, I guess, lessons that I learned from today's webinar talk, which is that the practice and the global circulations or transformations of performing arts from with a Chinese origin really is not monolithic, and it has multiple strands that needs to be unpacked in a very, very detailed way, right? In order for us to really see and where all these patterns, as you mentioned at the beginning, the migrant, diplomatic, academic, and even commercial patterns might intersect or even diverge, and the kind of perhaps power dynamics or the ebb and flow, right, of all of these patterns at different historical moments. So I think that probably means we will have to invite you again sometime in the near future. I really hope that we would have the opportunity to invite you over in person and speak with our audience members in person sometime soon. But since we're coming to the end of today's event, we have gone over time. Let us wrap up today's event on this note. Thank you so much for the conversation, for the talk, and for the Q&A conversation. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much everyone in the audience for participating in today's event.
Thank you so much also for hosting, and to all the audience for spending time listening And also thanks, of course, to the Center for Global Asia for making this opportunity possible.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so please follow us on our website, or follow us through our WeChat official account. Okay, we will see you again at the start of next semester. Okay, we will continue to run this series. So take care, everyone, and good night, Josh, to you. It's very late for you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.